Philosophy of Mind, Lecture 1, Mind and Body.
Try the following experiment. Look briefly at a bright light, then close your eyes and focus on what you see. You should detect what's called an afterimage, which starts out almost as bright as the original light and then begins to fade. But now consider this question. Where exactly was this, let's say, greenish image you just saw? It couldn't have been anywhere outside your head since your eyes were closed. But then it doesn't seem that it could have been anywhere inside your head either. If it were inside your head, then a brain surgeon could, in principle, see that image by cutting your head open in the right place. But that just doesn't seem right. All a brain surgeon ever sees inside heads are wet, mushy, gray and white brains, not greenish images. Similar considerations tell against the idea that the afterimage might be located anywhere around your eye, such as inside the lid or on the retina, since all an eye surgeon ever sees in those areas are groups of cells, active, inactive cells, not images, not green images, certainly. In short, there's just nothing green in your brain, inside your eyelid, or on your retina. So if the greenish afterimage was neither outside your head, inside your head, nor along the boundary separating inside from outside, where exactly was it? Similar considerations apply to thoughts. We feel vividly aware of our thoughts, typically, as we think them. We sort of hear them in our mind's ear, almost as if we have an inner voice, an inner monologue, with or by which we think our thoughts. But ask yourself again, where exactly are these thoughts? There's nothing relevant outside the head, obviously, since we're not using our ears to detect external sounds. And inside the head, the brain surgeon is still only going to find that wet, mushy brain stuff, lots of cells firing, but no sounds, nothing resembling an inner monologue. Our thoughts thus seem to be neither inside nor outside our heads. So where exactly are they? Welcome to the Philosophy of Mind. Introducing the mind. The most natural answer to the questions above, of course, is this. Afterimages and thoughts are in the mind. That's what most people will say. But this, of course, is no ultimate answer at all. It simply generates the next round of questions. If afterimages and thoughts are not located in physical space or in the brain, as we just mentioned, but they are in minds, then minds themselves must not be located in physical space or in the brain. But then where exactly are minds? And further, if minds are not located anywhere in space, then they have no spatial character or dimensions, no length, no breadth, no depth. And lacking these, they would lack volume. But if they lack volume, then nothing could literally be inside them. And most importantly, if minds are not themselves spatial in character, then how could they have any relationship, such as a causal relationship, to the brains which clearly have a lot to do with causing our behaviors and which are located in physical space? And why should we even believe that minds exist at all if they don't exist somewhere and have some sort of causal relationship to brains? These are some of the key questions constituting the philosophy of mind, and some of the questions we will be exploring throughout this course. What's particularly fascinating about these questions, to my mind at least, is this. They demonstrate that minds are very mysterious things, and that it's not at all obvious how we can make sense of them or how they fit into the world or the view of the world generated by our extremely successful sciences such as physics and neuroscience. And yet, at the same time, there could be nothing more obvious to us than that we have minds, that we're creatures with minds, and indeed that the features of our minds mark us off from practically every other thing we discover on Earth. So how can it be that this most obvious of things, our minds, can at the same time be so problematic and difficult to understand? Our first task will be to get a little clearer on just what we mean when we talk about minds. Examples of the mental. Well, we might begin by giving some paradigm examples of what the mind is not, namely examples of purely physical things, material things, things like rocks, trees, water, stars, atoms, molecules, and so on. In contrast, paradigm examples of mental things, things pertaining to the mind, might include such things as sensations, thoughts, beliefs, desires, emotions or feelings, intelligence, character, personality, so on. But what exactly are these sorts of things? We'll discuss a few of them in a bit more detail. First, sensations. Sensations come in various forms. Pains, itches, tickles, after images that we were talking about a moment ago, seeing, let's say, a round red patch when you're looking at an apple, hearing screeching car tires, feeling nausea. All of these would be examples of sensations. Some seem to be purely inner. We recognize, for example, that pains, itches, and tickles are purely sensations inside us, not in the objects which cause them. When we step on a nail, for example, we recognize that the nail causes pain that's in us, not that we're somehow perceiving pain that was already in the nail. In contrast, some sensations seem outer-oriented or outer-directed. When you see something such as a round red apple, you feel that the thing that you see, the roundness and the redness, is out there, unlike the pain case where the pain we feel is in us. Yet what sensations all seem to share, whether they're inner or they're outer, is that they have a certain qualitative nature. There's a certain way they feel, or there's something that it's like to experience them. We all know what it's like to feel pain, or what it's like to see red, or perhaps what red looks like, and we know how what red looks like differs from what green looks like, and so on. This qualitative nature is very difficult, maybe even impossible to describe adequately in words. You simply have to see the colors, or taste the flavors, or hear the sounds to know what they're like. Someone who cannot see simply cannot grasp what colors are like, and someone who's deaf, or perhaps has merely never heard a string instrument, just can't really grasp what the cello sounds like. Philosophers use a fancy term for this qualitative nature of sensations. They refer to the qualitative properties of our conscious experiences as qualia, and what marks off sensations from other kinds of mental states, it's often thought, is that they exhibit qualia, that there's something it's like to have them. So that's sensations. A second category of examples of the mental would be things like thoughts, beliefs, and desires. These will group together as examples of what philosophers like to call propositional attitudes. That's a rather fancy term, but the idea behind the term is actually pretty straightforward. In these cases, the subject is said to have an attitude towards a proposition where the proposition specifies what's called the content of the state. So let's take a look at a few examples. We might observe that Fred is thinking that it's time to buy a new car, or that Jane believes that shopping around is essential to getting the best deal, or that Horatio desires that the recession should come to an end. In the first example, the subject is Fred. He has the attitude of thinking directed towards the proposition, it's time to buy a new car. In the second case, the subject is Jane, who has the attitude of believing towards the proposition, shopping around is essential to getting the best deal. And in the final case, Horatio has the attitude of desiring towards the proposition that the recession should come to an end. There are many varieties of propositional attitudes. In addition to thinking, believing, and desiring, you might hope that something, fear that something, be outraged at something, and so on. But as it turns out, thinking, believing, and desiring are the most standard examples, and so those are the ones that we'll primarily focus on in this course. Two quick observations to make about propositional attitudes. First, unlike sensations, which have their very hard to put into words qualia, qualitative nature, propositional attitudes like thoughts, beliefs, and desires seem to have a very intimate relationship to language. After all, at their core is a proposition which serves as their content. It's the thing the subject has the attitude towards, and propositions seem ideally suited towards linguistic expression. In fact, we'll talk about propositions or sentences interchangeably, and sentences are obviously linguistic entities. Second observation about propositional attitudes. It's often suggested that propositional attitudes are different from sensations in simply lacking qualia altogether. Arguably, at least, there's no particular feel to thinking or believing or desiring something. There's nothing specific that it's like to have one thought or desire rather than another, or at least not in anything like the very explicit way there's something that it's like to see or taste or feel something. A third category of mental things would be feelings and emotions. These are things such as anger, joy, sadness, depression, remorse, and so on. Like propositional attitudes, these are often attributed using propositions. We might say that someone is angry that something is the case, or feels depressed that something is the case. Yet, unlike propositional attitudes, feelings and emotions do seem to have a kind of qualia associated with them, a very distinct and noticeable qualitative feel. There's something that it's like to feel angry or sad or depressed, and these are very different sorts of feelings. And while their qualitative aspect makes them similar to sensations, there's also a difference between feelings and emotions and sensations. Sensations seem rather directly to be caused by the things that cause them. The pain is caused by the nail. The tickle is caused by the feather on your skin. The apple taste is caused by the biting into the apple, and so forth. But while you might be sad that there's so much suffering in the world, that suffering doesn't cause your sadness in the way that the feather might cause the tickling sensation you're experiencing. There's no direct physiological process in place in the way that our perceptual systems and our sensory organs operate to generate pains and tickles. So feelings and emotions can have something in common with propositional attitudes and something in common with sensations, but yet differ from each. A fourth and last category of mental items would include things such as intelligence, character, and personality. These two are phenomena which are often thought to be psychological or mental in nature. We talk about people's intelligence. We talk about their character being good or strong-willed or shifty maybe. We talk about personality, such as being witty or introverted, and so on. But these are often seen as kinds of derivative traits, ultimately related to more basic mental states or phenomena. To be intelligent, for example, might be just to be able to quickly form the right beliefs. To be morally good might just be having the tendency to form the right sorts of desires, and so on. Similarly, arguably at least, feelings and emotions are equally derivative. They're merely a combination of certain kinds of qualia, as in sensations, with propositional content, as in the propositional attitudes. In the interest of time, then, we won't say much more in this course about intelligence, character, and personality, or things such as feelings and emotions. Our primary focus, instead, will be on what most philosophers take to be really the most basic or fundamental mental phenomena, namely sensations and propositional attitudes, such as beliefs, desires, and thoughts. The mark of the mental. Now, if all of these things are examples of the mental, of things pertaining to the mind, can we now specify just what it is about them that makes them count as mental? Are there distinguishing marks of the mental that distinguish mental things, things pertaining to the mind, from purely physical things, such as the things on our earlier list? Philosophers suggest a number of possible criteria for the mental, each one having its own plausibility and covering certain kinds of cases, but perhaps no single criterion or criteria quite captures everything. In looking at a few of these, we'll focus on a qualia example, the pain caused, let's say, by some nerve damage that you might have in your tooth, but most of what follows applies to propositional attitudes as well. So this will be our example. The nerve inside one of your teeth deteriorates or suffers some sort of injury, resulting in your feeling some sharp, throbbing, and let's just say generally dreadful sensation of pain. The tooth, the nerve, and the injury are all purely physical things or processes, while the dreadful pain that they cause is allegedly mental in nature. The question we have now is, what exactly is the difference? What follows now are a few criteria for distinguishing the mental from the physical. The first few of these have to do with differences in how we know about mental things and physical things, but then we'll close by looking at two rather different sorts of criteria. So let's begin by looking at 4 interrelated knowledge criteria for distinguishing the mental from the physical. First one is called direct or immediate knowledge. You know you have your pains directly or immediately. That is, not based on any evidence or reasoning or inference. Your knowledge of your pain is not mediated by other beliefs or knowledge. You just simply feel it. Thus, it typically makes no sense to ask, how do you know you're having this pain? Because it's part of what it is to be a pain that you just know it when you feel it. The question of evidence seems inappropriate with respect to things like pains. Contrast all of those points now with the way you know about the physical nerve damage itself in your tooth. How do you know that there's some physical problem with your physical tooth? Well, the painful feeling itself suggests to you that there's something wrong with your tooth. It's your evidence that something is wrong with your tooth. But then you don't know about the physical damage directly or immediately. You only know about it by feeling your pain, and then doing some reasoning or inference about the pain. I feel pain. Nerve damage would cause that pain, therefore it's likely that I have nerve damage. Or alternatively, because of the pain, you might go to the dentist, who in turn will give you her diagnosis that you have nerve damage. Here, you learn about the nerve damage on the basis of somebody else's testimony. The dentist says it's damage. I believe she's credible. She's not just interested in buying herself a new boat, so therefore it's likely I have damage. Again, you use some reasoning or inference to learn about the physical damage. You don't simply know it directly or immediately. This then gives us our first possible criterion for distinguishing the mental from the physical. The mental is what we can know directly or immediately, while the physical can only be known indirectly on the basis of evidence and inference. Thus, what makes the pain mental is that you can know directly and immediately that you have it, while the nerve damage in your tooth is physical precisely because you only know about it indirectly on the basis of some sort of reasoning about what you do experience directly, namely the pain. A second criterion for distinguishing the mental from the physical. This one is called privacy or first-person privilege, and it's related to the first criterion. It's often suggested that mental states are private to the person having them, meaning at least that that person has a special kind of access to his own mental states that no other person can have to those very same states. That is, I have a special access or a first-person privilege with respect to my own mental states, and no one else can enjoy that access to my mental states. So, developing our first criterion a bit, I have direct access to my mental states. I can know them directly and immediately, but everyone else only has indirect access to my mental states. I know the pain of my toothache by feeling it, but the dentist knows that I'm feeling toothache pain only indirectly on the basis of evidence. She looks at the nerve damage, or she hears me say, "ah," and she concludes I must be feeling pain. So I have a privileged access to my own mental states. Physical things, to the contrary, do not support this kind of privacy or privileged access. Take the nerve and tooth themselves causing my pain. I can see them by looking into a mirror, but then anybody else can see them as well by looking into my mouth. And so, in principle, at least, you might not be allowed to look into other people's mouths without any sort of punishment, but if they let you, anybody can equally access anybody else's mouth. So this gives us the possible second criterion now, namely that the mental is that with which you have privacy or first-person privilege, and the physical is that which is at least in principle publicly accessible to all persons equally. This leads us to a third criterion distinguishing the mental from the physical, something called infallibility. One's knowledge of one's own current mental states, it's often suggested, is infallible. You simply cannot be mistaken about whether you're experiencing them. If you believe you're in pain, for example, then you are in pain. You can't be wrong about that belief. In contrast, any belief about a purely physical occurrence can be in error. You can't be wrong that you're feeling the pain of a toothache, though you could certainly be wrong about the underlying nerve damage. Perhaps the pain has some other source or origin altogether. Or to choose an even more dramatic example, a real-life example, there's an interesting phenomenon known as the phantom limb syndrome. Some people, after suffering the amputation of a limb, report sensations coming as if from the limb, so much so that they're shocked when they discover that the limb is actually gone. So imagine for a moment a person suffering from this syndrome who feels an itch in his missing leg. Clearly he cannot be wrong that he's feeling an itch, that he's having an itchy feeling. But he may well be wrong in believing that the physical cause of the itch is in his leg, in believing that he even has a leg. So that leads us to our third criterion. The mental is that which we can know infallibly, while the physical is something we always have the possibility of making errors about. Thus, what makes your pain, or the phantom itch in this case mental, is precisely that you can never be wrong about what you're experiencing, while the tooth, the nerves, and the limb are purely physical precisely because your beliefs about them can sometimes go wrong. And finally now, a fourth possible criterion. This one's called self-intimacy. It's the idea that mental states are what philosophers like to call self-intimating. A fancy word again, but the idea is pretty simple. It's the idea that it's impossible to have or be in a mental state without knowing that you have or are in that mental state. So, for example, you cannot have a pain that you're unaware of. It would be very strange to say, Fred is feeling terrible pain right now but doesn't know it. In contrast, there can be all sorts of purely physical things going on in us of which we're unaware, even the kinds of things that normally produce our pains. Thus, we generally have no idea at all about the physiological things occurring in our bodies, the workings of our digestive system, metabolism, our immune system, and so on. And we are, perhaps tragically, often unaware of the onset of various diseases, small and terrible, until they're well advanced and start causing symptoms. And indeed, there are many anecdotes about soldiers and athletes in the midst of action who suffer all sorts of even terrible physical damage, but simply don't feel the normally associated pain. So that's our fourth criterion. The mental is what you can't have without being aware of it, while the physical is something you can have without being aware of it. So, with our example, what makes your toothache pain mental is that you can't actually have that pain without knowing that you're having that pain, while the underlying bodily processes in the tooth and the nerve and the gums and so on are purely physical, precisely because they generally do their thing without your having any conscious awareness of them at all. So those are four possible criteria for distinguishing the mental from the physical. Our next question is to ask whether these are successful criteria. Putting them together, we get the idea that any given mind directly knows everything that occurs in it, does so in a way that no other mind can know it, and can never be wrong about what's going on inside itself. To the contrary, any given mind only indirectly knows about physical things, has no special access to anything physical not equally enjoyed by all other minds, at least in principle, and can indeed be unaware of or in error about them. These criteria definitely suggest some very important properties traditionally ascribed to the mind and to things mental, and it's clear that many mental states do display these properties much of the time. But right now, at least, we're hoping for something stronger than that. What we're seeking is to illuminate the difference between the mental and the physical, to gain some insight into what the mind and things mental are all about. And for that, we need criteria that clearly and unambiguously distinguish the mental from the physical. What we want, in short, are criteria such that all mental phenomena fulfill them, and no physical phenomena do, without exception. And the knowledge criteria that we've just been exploring, however useful they might be, and however frequently they may characterize mental things, do not quite succeed in providing the perfect satisfactory criteria. For it seems, alas, that perhaps not all mental phenomena display the properties we've been discussing, and even if they do, perhaps not all the time. So, for example, in this post-Freudian age, we often speak of unconscious beliefs, desires, and emotions, allegedly mental or psychological states that we're in, even without being aware of them. But if we can be in these mental states without being aware of them, then they are not always self-intimating, to use that fancy philosophical term again. Further, these days we recognize that we can often be wrong in various ways about our mental states. For example, we might be wrong about just what emotion we're feeling. Is it embarrassment or remorse? Is it envy or jealousy or anger? We can perhaps also be wrong about whether we desire something. Do I desire to be carefree and laissez-faire and let insults slide off my back? Or do I desire to stand up for myself? What is it I really want out of life, out of career, out of relationships, out of my wife? Numerous psychology experiments show that people are frequently wrong about their beliefs and their motivations. For one quick example, people will say that they bought a certain product because they believed it was superior to its competitors, and they'll even outline the various ways they believe it to be superior to its competitors. But marketers know full well that people tend to buy whatever product is at eye level and then essentially make up reasons for the purchase afterwards. If so, then so much the worse for the infallibility criterion, the idea that you can't be wrong about your own mental states. This last point also challenges the first-person privilege criterion, for it's often quite unclear whether we have such a privileged access to many of our propositional attitudes at least. Sometimes, perhaps, other people can tell us better than we ourselves what we actually think or believe or desire. Again, just ask any person with experience in advertising and marketing. They know how to instill beliefs and desires in you that you're not only unaware of, but you probably would deny having were you to be asked. And indeed, it's not even so clear that sensations enjoy that first-person privilege either. It may seem that you're an excellent authority about whether or not you're feeling or sensing something, but maybe your expertise is shakier than you realize. Ask yourself, is this a pain or just a high degree of warmth I'm sensing? Is the pain I feel now more or less intense than the one I felt a moment ago? When the optometrist asks you, which line is in better focus, the top line or the second line, are you really perfectly confident of your answer? What we might conclude then is that the knowledge criteria for distinguishing the mental from the physical provide a useful first blush way of distinguishing the two. The mental is typically what we have a direct, infallible, privileged access to in a way that we don't for what's physical, but these criteria are not perfect or complete. They're not perfectly exhaustive. We'll turn now to two very different sorts of criteria for distinguishing the mental from the physical, which we'll call metaphysical criteria. Two metaphysical criteria for distinguishing mental from physical. These criteria do not focus on the different features displayed by our knowledge of the mental as opposed to our knowledge of the physical. Instead, they focus on a couple of important properties that the mental and physical are alleged not to share. First one is spatiality. This is the property of being spatial, having spatial dimensions such as length, breadth, and width, or being located in space, literally having some location somewhere in the physical universe. According to the great 17th century French thinker René Descartes, the I think therefore I am guy, everything physical displays or possesses spatiality while nothing mental does. So what makes a particular thing a physical thing is precisely that it has length, breadth, and width, as well as a location somewhere. Consider all the members of our paradigm list of physical things earlier: rocks, trees, water, stars, and so forth. They all seem to fit that criterion. But Descartes claims the mental is not like that. The thought experiments that we started with in today's lecture illustrate that. After images and thoughts don't seem to have any location anywhere in or around the brain. Nor does it make sense exactly to ask about the spatial features of thoughts or things like sensations. We don't ask, how big is that thought, or what's the volume of that itch? Why not? Because thoughts and sensations just are not spatial in character. So that's our first metaphysical criterion. The physical is what is spatial, while the mental is not. As we'll see in our next lecture, this criterion will lead directly to the position, famously supported by Descartes, known as dualism. That's the idea that the mental and physical are two entirely different sorts of things altogether. And that, of course, wouldn't be surprising. If one is spatial in nature and the other isn't, they must be entirely different sorts of things. Let's briefly evaluate the spatiality criterion. While this initial description is pretty straightforward, and this criterion has been extremely influential over the last several centuries, in recent decades in particular, there has arisen quite a bit to call into question just how complete the spatiality criterion actually is. Contemporary physics, for example, may not quite endorse the idea that all physical things are truly spatial in nature. Physicists speak of things such as point particles and forces and strange things called wave functions, and none of these seem to fit the criterion. Point particles, while perhaps having a position, seem to lack length, breadth, and depth. Forces are said to have strength at locations, but not themselves be located there. And wave functions are fancy ways of suggesting that particles such as electrons are not in fact truly located anywhere, but rather themselves are merely probabilities of being found at various places. Thankfully, we can avoid the technical details here, but the idea seems to be that many genuinely physical things simply do not fit the spatiality criterion. In the reverse direction, meanwhile, there are things which seem to lack spatial character, and yet which are not mental in nature. For example, philosophers love to speak of things called abstract objects, objects which are not located anywhere in space, but which no one thinks of as being mental in nature. Take numbers, for example. The numbers 27, or pi, or -3 aren't literally located anywhere in space, nor do they have any spatial dimensions, Yet they're also not very good candidates for being mental things. They're not thoughts, they're not sensations, they're not feelings, and so on. And finally, it seems problematic in general to believe that anything could exist that doesn't exist somewhere. So if non-spatiality characterizes the mind, the mental, then it becomes a strike against even believing in the reality of the mental. That may seem like a very odd thing to say, but as we'll see, especially in Lecture 14 at the end of the course, there are many philosophers who believe that all that really exists is the physical world, including the brains in the physical world, and that minds are just a kind of fiction or illusion. Insisting that minds exist elsewhere, i.e., nowhere in the physical universe, as the spatiality criterion suggests, is, for these philosophers, just further reason for insisting that they don't exist at all. Let's turn then to one last possible criterion for distinguishing mental from physical. This one also gets a fancy name. It's called intentionality. Intentionality is the property of aboutness. Something has this property insofar as it's capable of having an object or being about something other than itself. Consider first something which lacks it, a piece of wood. This purely physical thing isn't about anything at all. It just is what it is, lying there, being itself. But now consider, say, the thought that Fred was having earlier about buying a new car. That thought does have an object. It is about something, namely that car, or more precisely, the proposition that it's time to buy a new car. In fact, it's precisely because they have such objects that the states we earlier called propositional attitudes, attitudes towards propositions such as thinking that something, desiring that something, and so on, are often called by philosophers intentional states as well. All of them have objects, something that they're directed towards, something they're about, namely those propositions which provide their content. And of course, these propositional attitudes, intentional states, are some of our paradigm examples of mental states. So our last criterion for distinguishing mental from physical is just this. The mental is what displays intentionality, while the purely physical lacks it. Or to put that without the fancy words, mental phenomena have objects or are about things other than themselves, while purely physical things are about nothing at all. Now note, interestingly, that the objects of mental states need not in fact be things which actually exist. The Spanish explorer Ponce de Leon desired to find the fountain of youth, but it didn't exist. His state of desiring to find something counts as a mental state and has intentionality as about something, the fountain of youth, even when that object doesn't exist. Similarly, many people believe that Bigfoot exists, but it's my understanding anyway that he doesn't. So Bigfoot is the object both of their beliefs and of mine. It's the thing the beliefs are about, even if the man or the beast or whatever it is he's supposed to be himself doesn't exist. And of course, in general, you can think of, argue for, write about, or even love non-existent objects. So intentionality, aboutness, does not presuppose the actual existence of the object in question. Let's briefly evaluate the intentionality criterion. The question is whether this criterion ultimately succeeds in clearly distinguishing the mental from the physical. First, do all mental states in fact display intentionality, have an object that they're about? Many philosophers think that sensations don't actually have a content in this way, that they don't seem to be about anything or directed towards anything. You just feel the pain or the tickle, and they don't seem to be about anything other than themselves. Or perhaps you feel just generally sad or depressed without being sad or depressed about anything in particular. But if so, then these seem to be mental states which lack intentionality. More problematically, there seem to be genuinely physical things which do display intentionality, at least in some form. Linguistic objects such as words and sentences have it, for example. The sentences you are now hearing are purely physical objects. They're sounds, they're vibrating air molecules. And yet, insofar as they're meaningful, there is something they are about. And when I say, check out that cat on my computer, the sounds I have uttered are about that cat and my computer in just the same way as my thoughts and beliefs may be about that cat and my computer. And we can easily multiply such examples. The electrical circuits inside your computer subserving your word processing program. They allow what you type to be meaningful and thus be about things. A photograph is a purely physical object, a splattering of colors or ink on some paper, and yet the photograph is of something. It has an object. Thermostats have readings about the temperature, and so on. All of these seem to be purely physical objects which have objects or aboutness. Now there's a lot more to be said about such examples, and we'll say quite a bit of it actually in later lectures, but this will suffice for now. Intentionality is clearly an important property, and many mental states clearly display it, but more will have to be said before it could serve as a clear way of demarcating the physical from the mental. We began this lecture by exploring various paradigm examples of physical and mental things. The former included rocks and molecules, while the latter included sensations and thoughts and feelings and so on. We then asked just what it is exactly that distinguishes the mental from the physical. Just what is it that all mental things have, by virtue of which they are mental, and all physical things have, by virtue of which they're physical? We examined a variety of candidate criteria, 4 concerning the different ways we have knowledge of the mental as opposed to the physical, and 2 metaphysical criteria. Although all of these are of some use, I suggested, none of them quite manages to provide what we sought, criteria such that all mental things have them and no physical things, or vice versa. What remains unclear, in other words, is whether we even have a single unifying concept of the mental, a single thing that all mental states share and all physical things lack. Nevertheless, what emerges from our discussion is that what we've called qualia and intentionality are extremely important phenomena which will provide much of the subject matter of the rest of our course. For some mental states at least, there's something that it's like to experience them, their qualia, and this seems essential to them. Sensations and feelings are prime examples. For other mental states, that there's something they're about, that they have an object, their intentionality seems essential to them. What we will call equally propositional attitudes or intentional states, such as thoughts, beliefs, and desires, are prime examples. Arguably, qualia and intentionality are together at the heart of what is mental, and so understanding them better is essential to understanding the mind and its difference from, and relationship to, the physical, including the brain. With this established, we are now poised to begin our study of some of the major positions that philosophers have taken with respect to the relationship between the mental and the physical, between minds and bodies. The spatiality criterion we just examined sets the stage for the first position known as dualism, and it's with that we shall begin the next lecture.
This ends Lecture 1.